Hi, it's Mike Stevenson. In today's video, we're going to talk about Logic App connections as part of the series for understanding Azure costs. Before we jump in, a big thanks to Turbo360 who support me growing the channel with help for some of the videos. Now, what we're going to have a look at is I've been doing some videos looking into the deeper dive on different resource types to understand the costs. So today we're going to focus on Logic App connections. First off, I've got a graph showing all of my Logic App related costs from a typical integration platform. So here I've got a breakdown by meter of all of the different types of costs. So you can see some of the ones that we'd call out here. So this one's related to enterprise connectors used by Logic App consumption. There's consumption built-in actions, consumption data retention. So those are probably I think this one as well actually, standard connection actions. So those ones probably relate more to the Logic App consumption that you might have, and then some of the other costs for things like this cost here. These costs here will relate more to the app service for Logic App Standard. So we're going to take a look at the connections in both types of scenario. Now, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to look at a Logic App Standard, very typical application, and we're going to have a look at what some of the costs that made up this application are. Now, just as a caveat, in this application, I've deliberately used some cloud connectors in cases where I could have used built-in connectors as well, just to really show what the cost would look like. So in this typical application, there's a number of different costs we've got. Now, everybody always assumes for Logic App Standard, I just pay for my app service, but actually that's not the only cost that you're going to have. So here I've got my ASE plan, which has taken up the bulk, the bulk of my cost for this Logic App scenario. Now, what we've got to remember is this app service plan could be used by multiple Logic apps at the same time. So really, this is a shared cost here. Now, the Logic App that I'm looking at does have some specific costs. So the first one to note is the Logic App data transfer cost would show up, and that's really related to the app itself. We then have these connectors. So these were all web connectors, and you can see each of those shows as a separate line. So I know how much I'm spending on SQL, how much I'm spending on Dataverse. In cases where I use the built-in connectors, those connectors would actually be included in the cost for the app service plan, so they wouldn't be separated out. So this will give you a flavour of some of the things in this app, and probably the couple of things to notice are the data transfer wasn't huge but is noticeable, but these connector costs here, here and here, they were actually sort of, when I total those up, they're about a third of the cost of the app service plan. So if you're doing a lot of cloud connectors, make sure you're planning those costs into what the running cost for your Logic app is going to be. So next up, if we take a little bit of a lower level look at this, so what I've got here is each row is a resource in Azure for the different connectors. So you can see I've actually got two service bus connectors. I've got the Dataverse and I've got a SQL connector. So that gives me a view here of how much I was paying for each of those connectors across a month. So you can see my SQL connector was actually getting used quite a lot. And it's probably a really good case to use that built-in SQL connector where you can, just because of the volume of data you're processing. So next up, we've got a side-by-side graph showing the usage of these connectors from last month and this month. Now, what's really worth noting is the costs for the connectors are going to be variable. So you would see here this month particularly, it's not a huge difference, but we've had some variance in the cost, maybe a bit more than compared to last month though. So the cost for that app service plan hosting my Logic app in Logic App Standard is a very static cost unless I've got any kind of burst scale going on. But but the connector costs are going to be very variable depending on how many messages I've processed. So be aware that that's something that might affect how your overall costs look. Now, next up, we're going to have a look at logic app consumption. So here, I'm looking at all of my logic apps. So I might have quite a few of them. I'm looking at them by meter. So here, these are the things we noticed before. So we've got our standard connectors, built-in actions, data retention, and you can see if we look up here on the diagram. On the diagram, you can see my standard connectors actually takes up the bulk of my costs. So what I've done here is I'm looking at data by logic app workflow resource type, and then the graph's showing me the meters within all of my logic apps. You can see most of my cost for my logic apps actually goes on the cloud connectors. Probably, let's say there's about 2/3 of the cost goes on there. Then probably about a third of my cost is the built-in actions. So this is probably, the reality is I probably use more built-in actions than I do cloud connectors, but the cost difference between the two is quite significant. And then at the top, I think we've got the enterprise connectors up here. So that's the smallest cost to have. Now, enterprise connectors cost a lot more than standard and built-in actions. So, you tend to only use these in very specific scenarios for connecting to something like SAP. So you're not going to use them as much, but it is still quite a noticeable cost, even though there's something quite specific. And then I think the last bit, this one here, is my data retention. So that's really the workflow run history storage. Now, what we've got to remember is all of these specific costs, this broken down by meter, when I look at my bill, that actually gets rolled up to be the cost of the workflow. So I would see one billing item for each, if I look at my resource level costs, I would see one cost for each workflow, and then I'd have to break down into the meters to be able to see this view here. Okay, so if we look at a single logic app now, so in the last graph I was looking at across all of my logic apps. Now I've just chosen one single logic app, and this one's logic app consumption. And what you'll notice here is this one actually has quite a lot of enterprise connector usage here. So across the period of time, it was quite a big cost for that enterprise connector. Now, one of the interesting things is if you were doing logic app standard instead of logic app consumption, you're still going to have that cost for that enterprise cloud connector. So it might be the case that there wasn't really a huge difference for this particular logic app, whether it lived on standard or consumption, because most of the cost goes on the enterprise connector anyway, which was quite interesting. You would see here, for example, the built-in actions. There's very little cost, if any, for that particular workflow. Now, looking at a different logic app this time, you can see here I'm looking at my standard connector actions. So what you could do with your billing data is if you're looking at the meters, you could maybe do something like look at the cost of my standard connections by, across a month, for example, and you can get a view of what the costs look like and track how it's going up and down. So you might do something like create graphs where you look at it, your standard enterprise and built-in actions across the month, and just kind of look at how your logic app costs are going. If there's if you're finding that you're heavily using enterprise connectors, you might be able to tune and save some cost by changing the way you connect to an external system if it's going to be problematic, the running costs for that. Now, what I would say is in this video, I didn't want to spend a huge amount of time in this video talking about connectors because I've already done 2 videos previously about logic app standard and logic app consumption as 2 separate videos where I talked a lot about the optimization. So if you're interested in different ways you can optimize the cost in a more general logic app video, check those videos out because I think you might find these useful. But in today's video, I just wanted to look at what you see in the billing API data if you're looking at just the connectors itself, and a couple of a couple of observations I wanted to make on this just to really call them out. So let's start with Logic App Standard. So the first one is the cost for a standard Logic App Standard cloud connector is separate from the cost of the Logic App plan. So that's the first key point. So Logic App Standard, you've got your app service plan cost, but if you use a cloud connector, you're going to have a separate cost for a resource that is the cloud connector. And that's the key difference between standard and consumption really is, if we look at the cloud connector down here, the cost of the cloud connector included with the workflow. So that's really a difference in how Microsoft have implemented standard versus consumption. And I think, consumption came along first, and it was really easy to kind of roll the costs together. But the problem is, because the Logic App Standard lives on an app service, which is a separate cost, they've obviously had to separate those two billing items out. So in standard, you pay a separate cost for the cloud connector, whereas in consumption, it's kind of included, but it's a meter. So the impact of this basically means in Logic App Standard, you can work out the cost of each connector, whereas in Logic App Consumption down here, you can't really work out the cost of each connector because the cost's actually part of the workflow. And when you look at the broken down data in the workflow, it doesn't really tell you which connector was used. It only rolls it up and says you spent $1 worth of cloud connectors, but it doesn't tell you which connector it was. So there is a difference there. Now, on Logic App Standard, we do have the built-in connectors, and these are included in the cost of the Logic App plan. So in a way, that means it's sort of free. Now, obviously, by free, what do we actually mean? So what I mean is you won't pay an additional billing cost for the Logic app itself to call using a built-in connector, but you may still pay a cost. For example, if it's a service bus, you may pay a cost for a transaction or a message on service bus, and you may pay a cost for a transaction on storage. So remember that the cost itself, there can be more than just the Logic app part of it. But from a Logic app perspective, you don't pay an extra cost for using a built-in connector. And then I think the last one I want to call out is enterprise connectors cost a lot more than cloud connectors. So if you're going to use an enterprise connector very heavily, maybe have a think about what approach you want to do. I've talked about this in the previous video about some other approaches where integration with SAP was done via APIs instead of a connector because it had quite a big impact on the cost. And I think you saw that in the earlier example where there's a SAP connector cost can be quite expensive, even though it's not really doing that much. So hopefully this was a short video. Just want to dig a little bit deeper on those Logic app connector costs to help people understand what the data actually tells you and the difference between the two types of Logic apps. Thank you for listening to today's video and have a great week.